Genesis chapter 13 will be part of our text tonight. We will look at a few additional chapters, but that's where we're going to start. Good to see everybody here. We've got some who are still filing in, so come on in and find a seat. I know we have some listening in the parking lot, and we have some listening to our live stream. Whatever you're doing to make some time for this study tonight, we appreciate that, and hopefully it will be helpful. Cody, it's just me and you again tonight. We anticipate Jim being back with us on Sunday, but until then, we'll just try to hold it down. So our study tonight in Genesis chapter 13 focuses on Lot, and I think the title that Jim gave this was Lot, a testimony to bad decisions, and it's not really hard to see that Lot made some bad decisions, and that's really kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. But the first thing maybe we just mention is, who is Lot? Because we haven't been introduced to Lot up until this point. If you remember our last lesson, we started at the end of Genesis chapter 11. We were introduced to a man named Abram. And Abram will become Abraham, and he will become a central character throughout the rest of the Bible. Remember, God has made promises that He's going to bring a Savior into the world. He's not been called a Savior yet, but we know that's what Jesus is going to be. So the first mention of that is all the way back in Genesis 3. And then in Genesis 12, we start to get a little bit more insight to that. To Abram, he makes these promises, most notably in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And it goes on to talk about Abram moving towards this land of Canaan. And from that point on, we get to chapter 13. And it says, so Abram went from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. And verse 2 says, now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he went on his journey from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he made there formerly, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So that's not our first introduction to Lot. Remember, Lot is introduced back in the end of chapter 11 where Abram is first mentioned. He is the nephew of Abram. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of verse 27. These are the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. So that's our introduction to Lot. We don't know much about Lot other than he's introduced here. He's the nephew of Abraham. And then he moves with Abraham. So we really get to Genesis chapter 13 and absolutely know very little about Lot. We really know he's moved around with Abraham. He is the nephew of Abraham. I am under the impression that he's probably pretty well blessed. We know Abraham is pretty wealthy. The fact that he has flocks that are big enough, that he has servants that are maybe causing a little bit of conflict with Abraham's livestock, maybe he's pretty blessed materially. But verse 5 and verse 6 really introduces us to a little bit of a predicament, Cody, because you've got this big family, a fairly big family. They're all trying to live in one spot, and there's a little bit of a predicament with their situation.
Right. Let's just go ahead and read through verses 5 through 7 of Genesis 13. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling with them in the land. So there is a predicament. There's a problem going on, and the issues are arising because they live so close together. We've already talked about how Abram was very rich in livestock, but I think in verse 6 there says that their possessions, Abram and Lot's possessions, were so great that there isn't enough room for the both of them. The land, it said that the land could not sustain them. There's not enough space. And I think that's a fulfilled promise. God had said that He was going to bless Abram and his household, but they're on the cusp of this maybe smaller problem actually becoming a bigger problem, because there's that friction between them. And Abraham, he's so worried. He's worried about this strife maybe moving up the ladder, because right now the conflict is strictly between the herdsmen. But Later on, Abram is going to say, like, don't let this strife be between me and you. He's worried about the strife getting worse and actually becoming a hindrance between their relationship as well. So because there's this predicament or there's this problem, Jared, obviously I think that there needs to be a solution to the problem.
Yeah, so Abraham says in verse 8, Abram said to Lot, Abraham and Abram, I know I'm bouncing back and forth.
It's hard.
It's, one and the same to me, right? So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right, or if to the right, then I will go to the left. And so here's the solution. You've got two families, you've got large herds, you've even got the Canaanites and the Perizzites. I take that to kind of indicate that the land is even more crowded. And so obviously this living situation is not going to work. So Abram comes up with the solution, and the solution is, you just choose your way. You choose a way, and then whatever way you choose, I'll go the opposite way. So to me, this seems like a pretty generous plan on Abram's part.
Yeah, first of all, I like the fact that he's the one that maybe spearheads the solution, the problem solving. He's the one who initiates the solution, because there's this problem, and Abraham, he sees it, and he's like, okay, well, I need to be the one to take care of it. I think that godly people need to recognize when there's a problem and go ahead and take care of it. But I think that we see a couple of different maybe principles that are established here as far as some things that Abraham values and some things that he's going to use moving forward. Because he kind of takes a back seat to Lot here. He gives him the choice to say, okay, when you pick one land, I will go the opposite way. He's showing humility. He's humbling himself. He's moving himself below Lot. Because really, he had the right to pick where to live, I would say, because he's Abram, he's the leader, he's the patriarch of the family. Lot is simply just his nephew, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't decide to pull rank. He decides to humble himself and say, okay, clearly there's an issue, but I'm going to have the humility that's necessary in order to lower myself so that we can take care of that problem. And I think that's going to be a theme moving forward as far as his humbleness. That's probably something that we need to keep in mind too whenever there's some strife.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But for now, notice in verse 10, here's Lot's choice. So Abram sees this problem. In order for there not to be strife, he comes up with a solution. He gives Lot the choice. And then Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So Lot had the choice, and it says that Lot chose this particular land, the valley of the Jordan. And obviously in hindsight, and when we read this a little bit further, we're going to come to the conclusion that this was a bad choice. But do you think it's immediately clear that this was a bad choice or not?
Not particularly. I think it's kind of hard to tell, at least specifically with what the information that the text gives us. Obviously, the outcome, the final conclusion of everything is going to be bad. But we can't always judge a decision based on what the end is, because maybe there's limited perspective, maybe there's limited knowledge. In fact, here in verses 12 and 13, it says, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly, and sinners against the Lord. So verse 13 kind of gives us a sneak peek into what's going on in the land. But I don't think we know that Lot knows that, right?
Well, yeah, that's the question that I have. Does Lot know what verse 13 states?
Right.
Because we know that, and this is hard for us because we know the story well. Like in just knowing the whole story, you can immediately know Lot makes a bad choice from the beginning. But I don't know that that's right to say that he makes this choice knowing that he may or may not. Yeah. But verse 13 gives us information. I just don't know if Lot had that information or not.
Yeah, I don't think the text tells us whether he knows it or not, so we probably just need to leave it there. I know Abram gives him the option of going to Sodom, so in my mind, I don't know how much they could have known, because Abraham is a righteous man, and Lot, we're going to find out, he's a righteous man as well. I don't know that Abraham would have even given Lot that option if everybody knew that this was such a wicked land. But regardless, we don't know because the text doesn't really tell us. But what we do know is we do know what he saw in the land. In verse 10, he lifted up his eyes and saw that the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So he saw the land, we can say that, and we can deduce that he saw that the land was plentiful. He saw that it was good land. And he gives some pretty specific descriptive phrases. He said it's well watered everywhere. I think you can just see how that would be a good thing. He compares it to the land of Egypt, which was the power at that time. So this is great land, and that's the only thing that's mentioned as far as what Lot is thinking about while he's making this decision. So Jared, I'm of the mindset that's really all that's on his mind. He was thinking maybe materialistically. So he's definitely setting himself up to make a bad decision if he's already thinking about it like that, because there's no mention of God. He doesn't look at the land and decide, oh, are there godly people living here? And so if material thinking, if that was his focus, then his decision-making process was automatically going to be off. And I think that looking at it from a material standpoint, that was the driving force for his decision-making process. But Jared, aren't there some passages that show that maybe he didn't even choose to go into Sodom, that really he started a little bit further out and then kind of like progressively went in?
Yeah, that's what the language seems to indicate to me. That Abram settled, this is verse 12 of chapter 13, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley. And in chapter 14, we're going to recognize or see some more city names. I think all total, there are kind of like 5 cities that make up this area. Mm-hmm. And so the reading of verse 13, or I'm sorry, verse 12 of chapter 13, to me at least seems to indicate that he settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. So to me, it doesn't look as if his first move is a move right into the city of Sodom. It looks just like maybe a step in that direction. But then when you get to chapter 14, and chapter 14 gets overlooked quite a bit, and we'll really largely overlook it tonight too, I guess. But there's maybe what we would say there's this political war between a lot of these kings, and Lot, because he was living in that area, kind of gets caught up in it. And it's a pretty cool story that Abram recognizes this, and eventually he's going to send some of his own men to come rescue Lot out of this. But verse 12 of chapter 14 says that they also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. So I think the text there is pretty clear. It says he's living in Sodom. So I know for a fact at this point he's living in Sodom. Whether he was initially or not, maybe not clear to us. But then I want you to turn to chapter 19. Because chapter 19 says, now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and where was Lot sitting? Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And this probably doesn't make just a ton of sense to us today, because cities are not quite what they used to be. Travel's different than what it used to be. But if I understand this correctly, the men who would sit at the gates of the city were kind of like the prominent men of the city. So it seems as if by this point, and I don't know exactly how much time has passed between here and there, because you've got quite a bit that's going on in between chapter 13 and chapter 19. You've got these angels visiting Abraham. They're promising a son to him and Sarah. You've got the covenant of circumcision that happens in 17. Verse 18, the birth of Isaac again is promised. So you've got a pretty long period of time in between 13 and 19. But the way that I read it, Cody, it looks like he moved that direction, then he moved into the city, and then he didn't just move into the city. He is a prominent citizen of the city. So going back to that original question, was this initially a bad choice? Maybe, maybe not. Right. But at this point, we know without a doubt the choice has turned into being a bad choice, because He's living among the wickedness. And when we start reading in chapter 19, and that's not really our text for tonight, by the way, that's really kind of, Sodom is our text for Sunday.
Yeah.
So we won't say a whole lot about chapter 19 tonight, but you know the wickedness that goes on there. It's not possible that he's living in the city, have become a prominent part of this city for any length of time, and he doesn't know what's going on. So kind of coming back to your thought there, may not have been a bad decision initially. At this point, though, it's really clear it's a bad decision.
Yeah.
So what was it you think that started that downward spiral?
Yeah, I think we can definitely say at the end, it's certainly a bad decision because God is going to rush him out of there because it's just a bad thing. But here's the point. So if materialism caused him to seek to be living in that land, so what would happen if he were to realize that living in Sodom is actually better for him or beneficial for him than living just outside of it? He's going to make that decision. He's going to go into the land. And then if he realizes that actually being a prominent citizen, that gives him even more material value, well, he's going to go ahead and do that too. So if you can kind of just see how his priority list is completely out of whack, and it's because he's strictly looking at it from a material standpoint. So I don't even think that Lot gave himself a chance to make a good decision because he's not even thinking in a godly way. He's not thinking about godly things. And so while it's kind of hard to know if exactly what he knew and what he didn't know, we can definitely see his priorities. We can see that they're a little bit off. And these priorities, they caused him to make all of those bad decisions. So maybe finding the source, the thing that might cause the bad decisions, maybe that's more profitable than just trying to figure out whether or not the decision was bad or not. Because we were talking beforehand that, kind of everybody understands that bad decisions come with bad consequences. And sometimes we do have to teach that there are going to be some consequences. But by and large, we have to teach ourselves to focus on the things that cause us to make those bad decisions. And I think here with Lot, we can see that his process is off because he was looking at it from a materialistic standpoint. But even still, even if we don't know if he was necessarily right or wrong initially, there are some consequences of the choice that he makes, the choice that he makes in deciding to move towards Sodom. Number one, I think he endangers his family from a spiritual standpoint. I think you can assume that he has his family's best physical interests at heart based on the land that he chose. It was fruitful land, and you can just imagine how blessed his future offspring would have been if they got to live in the land as well. But how about spiritually? How are they going to fare? We know that they're not going to fare well, but that doesn't seem to be part of his decision-making process. And Jared, his whole family ends up being corrupted on a major level towards the end. Maybe specifically his wife and his daughters that are mentioned too.
Yeah. So chapter 19 is just disturbing, and I don't know any other word to describe it. Like gross, disgusting, disturbing. I don't know. You get the point, right? Like chapter 19. It's just this terrible chapter because you have these men of the city. They're wanting to do despicable things to these visitors who happen to be angels. And then Lot makes this offer to give his daughters to them. And those things kind of hard to deal with. Again, our intention tonight is not necessarily to talk a lot about Sodom. Again, we'll save that for Sunday. But there are a couple of things in chapter 19 that I think help us see when you talk about did this choice ruin his family spiritually, and I think there are some pretty strong indications. We read about Lot's daughters, and they have he has daughters that are about to marry, and so these are future sons-in-laws that he has. These girls are what we would say they're engaged. And the only thing that you can probably infer from that is that they are marrying men from Sodom. And I don't think that would speak more spiritually, knowing what we know about the men of Sodom. If they have made the decision to marry men from Sodom, maybe that's an indicator that they have not got good spiritual bearings.
Right.
But then you get into the really disturbing part of chapter 19, the latter part, where after they have left the city, Lot's wife is deceased. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But you get to this cave that they're in, and the daughters come up with this plan that we need some way to carry on the family name. And so they get their father drunk, and then they have sexual relations with him, and they bear children. And so that's disturbing, and there's not a good spin I think you can put on that. But I think that too kind of shows where their minds are. I think this is some pretty wicked thinking. So for a righteous man to have daughters that think in that way seems to say the daughters are not like the father. Yeah. So I think they've been corrupted in Sodom. And then there's the wife, and we remember, what do we remember about Lot's wife? Remember Lot's wife, but the thing that we remember about her is that she looked back, and she was turned into this pillar of salt. And I remember when I was a kid hearing about that, I was like, well, what did Lot's wife do? It's like she turned around and she looked at the city. And I had a really hard time for a long time thinking, oh, what's the big deal? Like, I know they were told not to look back. But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. That's verse 26. And on the surface, that doesn't necessarily seem like that's a real crime, other than if she was told not to. And if you're told not to, don't. It's probably a good rule. Yeah. But, so what do you think is going on when she looks back? Do you think it's more than just she's curious to see the clouds and the dust and the burning and see what's happening? Do you think it's more than that?
Yeah, I think her heart's still in Sodom. You know, she had to take one last look back. You know, maybe I'm not going to say that she was gonna go back, but if the Lord told you not to look and you have such a strong pull that you have to turn, I think that kind of lets you know where your heart is at that point. Is that what you think too?
Yeah. So I think now that I've thought through it a little more clearly, or I've heard somebody a lot smarter than me teach it, I have come to conclude that I think her look back is a look with fondness. Yeah. Like she had become part of that city. Mm-hmm. Kind of like Lot had become part of that city. He's a citizen of that city. He's a prominent person. He's a leader. He's one of the men that sits at the gate. So I think she had become fond of the city too, and so her leaving, because when we read about Lot, he's not in a hurry to go either. Like he has to be kind of pressured and grabbed by the arm and yanked out of there too. Yeah. And so maybe he had some fondness too, but I think that was probably her downfall. And I think about that in light of kind of what Jesus said, where Jesus said that anybody that puts their hand to the plow and turns back is not fit for the kingdom. And I think Jesus is essentially saying the same thing. Like if you make a commitment to the kingdom, then the last thing that you can do is keep looking back to the world that you left behind. Yeah. And I think that's probably been a difficulty, and maybe all of us have faced that difficulty or had to deal with that before, that sometimes when we come out of the world, there are things that we leave behind that we're really not all that excited about having left behind. And so sometimes we have to deal with that and we have to work through that. And so in light of what Jesus says, there are some who will make a commitment to the kingdom, but they keep looking back. And what he means by looking back, I think, is you're kind of missing what you have left behind. Yeah. And I think that may be an explanation as to what's going on with Lot's wife here. So I think you're right. I think this was a decision that ultimately corrupted his daughters, it corrupted his wife, and Lot himself didn't seem all that rushed to leave, but he did. So I'm thinking in the last little bit of time that we have now, and by the way, I don't think we mentioned this ahead of time, but our dismissal tonight will start at 6:40, 7:40. Yeah, 6:40 is already gone. 7:40. And we'll put it up on the screen so you know when to go get your kids. And then we're going to come back in all together, and then we'll have our invitation song, and our closing prayer. So that's what we're going to do here in just a few minutes. But before we get to that, let's just think about some lessons that we can walk away with. Cody, you mentioned earlier that decision that Abraham makes, that solution that he makes. And I think that's just really a good principle to think about when we recognize there's some kind of problem and we recognize there needs to be a solution. And I like what Abraham concludes there. If you'll turn back to chapter 13 and look at verse look at verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. And I think that's a phrase that kind of stands out to me. Yeah. So Abram recognizes that this is a situation that's probably, I think you mentioned this, there's already some tension there. And if we don't do something, the tension's just going to grow. Yeah. And right now, maybe it's between the herdsman and the herdsman's family, but he clearly says, no strife between you and me. Mm-hmm. We're brothers. Yeah. And I just like the conclusion that he comes to, that we're brothers, therefore there doesn't need to be any strife, any dissension between us. And so Abram comes up with this solution, and in the solution, you've already alluded to this, but Abram yields, and he doesn't play the power card, he doesn't play the elder card, he allows Lot to get his way. And so I'm wondering, like, in our world today, Christians sitting here today in 2020, reading this story, thinking about Abram, thinking about the solution, thinking about what he does, are there some similar situations today, or are there situations today where we might be called on to try to find a solution to a problem to keep strife from happening?
Sure. And
how might we respond the same way that Abram does?
Yeah, number one, there's an obvious one with the different COVID stipulations that we have in place. These are areas where sometimes we have to yield for somebody else. Like sometimes there are things that we are doing right now that aren't necessarily comfortable. There are things that we wouldn't be doing on a regular basis, but we've looked out and we've decided, okay, like we can do this for the betterment of the group. I just think of just masks. Like I would never be wearing one. I'm not wearing one right now, but if I was sitting down there, I promise you I'd be wearing one too. But
does anybody think when COVID's over, you're just going to keep wearing the mask?
That's right. Like that is clearly a COVID stipulation. You think of the fish tank that we have to preach from. Like we have all of these different things in place. Even the Bible class protocol that we have in place. You guys are going to have to do extra things that you wouldn't normally have to do. And again, it's for the betterment of the group. It's to make sure that there's no strife and things like that. Paul talks about how he wouldn't even eat meat if it would offend his brother. And I just think of the incredible lengths that people are supposed to go to in order to make sure that there is no strife between brethren, that there's and that there's nothing in between us. I just wonder, would I be willing to give up a double cheeseburger from Five Guys if you said, okay, Cody, I don't feel comfortable with you eating that. Hopefully he's not going to test me on that, but that's obviously maybe extreme, but Paul's mentality there is that there is nothing that should be able to sever the relationship between brethren. I think that's Abraham's mentality as well. That's the mentality that all of us are supposed to have. I think that's the mentality that all of us are demonstrating right now. I remember we were studying in Proverbs chapter 6 earlier this week, and it talks about the 6 things which the Lord hates and the 7 which are an abomination. So, this is like top of the list. These are bad of all bad. And the very last thing is one who spreads strife among brothers. Like that is something that the Lord just hates through and through and through. And so even with things like the COVID protocol, I'm sure there are other situations that might pop up. They may not be as all consuming, but there could be something that might pop up just between me and one of you guys, or between any 2 members here. Godly people make sure that they don't have strife between each other. He says, we can't have this strife because we're brothers. And I think that needs to be our mentality. We're brothers, so there are things that we shouldn't be doing, and there are things that just cannot happen between us.
Yeah, and so if there's somebody maybe listening to this and you have strife in between you and a brother right now, then the clear lesson is that ought not be the case.
Right.
And so somebody's going to have to give in most cases, I would say. Yeah. Somebody's going to have to give. And you may have to swallow pride. You may have to just take the high road, is what we would say, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that is a good lesson here. I think that's just a good principle, and it's probably needed today as much as it's ever been needed. I hesitate to say more than ever, sure. but I think it's needed as much today as it's ever been needed before. We got to learn how to live like brothers, and sometimes that means, and that's not just in the church, that's in our marriage, that's with children, that's with every relationship we have. Yeah. Let me know when you get that burger, by the way.
Yeah, but kind of notice that at the end of their disagreement, though, Jared, like they're still brothers. And I think that's his point through and through. Like that's why you sacrifice the pride and you sacrifice all of those other things, is because they're still brothers. So even though they had to split, when you think later, I think it's in chapter 14, when there's that great big war and Lot gets captured, look who's there to get him. It's Abram, because he still recognized that they're brothers. They still have that relationship. You know, when God is going to destroy Sodom, Abram prays on Lot and the city's behalf. So even though they had that moment where there was some strife, they did everything that was necessary in order to preserve the relationship. I think that's a solid thing too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because Abram may have kind of been a little bit bitter.
Sure.
Like, of course you chose this land. This is the best. This is the best land. You know, I didn't expect you to choose it. I expected you to be like, oh no, you can have this.
Right.
But if he was bitter, he got over it pretty quickly, because, like you said, in chapter 14, he takes, I think it's 318 of his own men to go rescue. And then when Sodom is going to be destroyed, Abraham immediately has a heart there that goes after him. So you said this a few minutes ago, but I like this. A couple of days ago when we were talking about our class tonight, it's like, everybody knows that bad choices have bad consequences. So how do we teach a Bible class where we say more than that, which is kind of hard to do sometimes. But I think the thing that we determined is maybe what we need to discover is what made this a bad decision. And if we can kind of take it from that standpoint, what makes this a bad decision, then maybe we don't even have as many bad decisions to deal with in the future, because we get better at not making them, right?
Yeah, I think it's so much more important to determine how you got somewhere rather than where you are right now. I think you preached a lesson maybe a month ago, talking about it. You have to focus on where you're headed rather than where you are, because if you're a team and you're 5-5, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you started out 5-1 and now you're 5-5, well, that's obviously not a good thing. But if you started out 1-5 and now you're 5-5, okay, it matters how you got to this point. And so determining why you're making bad decisions, because there's always going to be a source. There's always going to be a core issue. You need to determine that, because otherwise you're kind of just maybe playing whack-a-mole, and you're just going to be trying to figure out how this problem is going to show up in all these different places. Whereas if you actually determine what the problem is, what's making you make those decisions, now you won't be making those decisions in the future. So I think it's just a better way of maybe consistently making good decisions. It's if you can determine what the problem is and go ahead and fix that.
Yeah. I'm really impressed that you remember something from a sermon a month ago.
Yeah, don't count on it.
Yeah. I don't even remember my own sermon from that long ago. So we touched on this earlier, where it seems as if Lot makes this decision through material eyes, not through spiritual eyes, and that kind of became the downfall. And I think you're right in that we have to kind of pick up on that and think. And maybe we've talked about this a lot in different ways, but thinking about how do we avoid this, I think about this, Proverbs study that we're doing right now, is that it just keeps screaming over and over and over again to seek wisdom, and then use that. So wisdom is comprised of just information. It's knowledge, it's discretion, it's shrewdness, it's prudence, it's all of those things. But I think ultimately what it says is that I've got all of this information, I need to use it. Everything needs to go through the filter, right? And if I make every decision using this filter, is this wise? Is this a good path? Then I think it probably helps us head off some bad decisions to start with.
Yeah, I think just of how much wisdom is just looking at the situation and assessing what's actually there. It's not like you have to do any type of like mental gymnastics. You're really just looking at what's going on and then making the proper decision based on that. We were talking about how he used those materialistic eyes, and that's how Lot got into trouble. I think that's something that can affect us today as well. I think especially in a society like we live in, where we're just incredibly blessed, and we're taught at a very young age to be super driven financially and things like that. Maybe we can have the tendency to have a materialistic view of life as well. I just listed a couple of different areas where that might even be possible. You think of school. Think of the normal questions that somebody might ask when they're trying to decide what school to go to. It's things like, what program do they specialize in? It's things like, will I be able to go to a good grad school after that? What jobs will I be able to get once I'm done there? And I think those are all good questions. We want to make smart decisions. We want to have wisdom. We want to assess the situation and make the best choices. But I think there's also some spiritual questions that need to be asked as well. Is there a faithful group of Christians to meet with? And I put the emphasis on faithful, not just a group of Christians. Is there a place that you can go and you can thrive there? Are there maybe people there in your age range that are really, really solid Christians? Because I know most young people, they need to be surrounded by other young, solid Christians. Is this a place where you can go and contribute as well? Because you're not just a consumer, it's not all about you. Is this a place that you can go and you can benefit the places around? Again, think spiritual over physical. Think of the different jobs that we might choose. Think of the normal questions. How much money will I make? What are the hours? How much will I have to work? What's the vacation time? Again, all good questions, but there's spiritual questions that have to be asked as well. Is there a group that I can worship with? Are the surrounding areas maybe good for evangelism? Is the workload going to have a negative impact on my spirituality? We don't need to act like there aren't physical and material ramifications to all of this, and considering that isn't bad, but when you're considering them to the neglect of considering some of the spiritual aspects, that's where it becomes a problem. There's just so much more at play in every single decision that we make rather than just the strictly physical things. There's so much spiritual. And Jared, I'm not quite at this point in my life yet, but we talked about how Lot's choices affected his wife and his children. So I can imagine there's so much that goes into making proper decisions when you have a wife and kids. There's got to be some spiritual ramifications too, right?
Yeah, and I think if you're a parent and you're looking at what happened to Lot and his family, this kind of hits hard because here's a man who's a good man. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, I think. He's a good man, but he makes some really critical mistakes. And I think the mistake that he made is that he looked at a land and he saw the immediate benefit, and that kind of overshadowed what are the long-term consequences of that. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, he lost his wife and he lost his daughters. Spiritually especially, he lost his daughters. And I just think about how parents today can make critical mistakes that can cause us to lose our family too. And I know parents don't have perfect control over what their children do, because I know a lot of people who've been really, really good parents, and they've done everything they can do to bring up their children to love God and to follow God, and they just don't for whatever reason. I think that sometimes happens. But I also think it's true that sometimes parents can make critical mistakes, maybe in the way that they prioritize their life. Maybe they make material-based decisions, not spiritual-based decisions, and their children see that, and that has a negative impact on them spiritually. So I think that's just a lesson that stands out to me. As a husband, as a father, Lot is a lesson of maybe we need to make sure we don't make critical decisions that have a negative impact on our family. But I mentioned Lot was a righteous man, and we get that from 2 Peter chapter 2. And I think you did the Cody head turn,
sure.
Would do that when you read this verse in 2 Peter chapter 2. It's making this reference about God and His ability to rescue righteous people out of bad situations. And Peter says if He rescued righteous Lot.
Yeah.
And from what we have read in Genesis chapter 13 and 19, you don't walk away with the conclusion that this was a righteous man.
No.
So how does Peter conclude that?
Oppressed by the sexual conduct of unprincipled men. I didn't know you were going to ask me that question, Jared.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Keep me on my toes.
Well, Peter just knows more than you and I know about
That's
Lot,
right. That's right.
Yeah.
And so we should trust in Peter's judgment of Lot rather than our own.
But I think what stands out to me is that obviously what we know about Lot is limited, and what we know about Lot is unfortunately kind of the negative.
Sure.
But he was mentioned, inspired apostle said that he was a righteous man, and he was being greatly affected by the unrighteousness that was around him, which is what you would expect. Yeah. But what that says to me is that righteous people can sometimes make really bad mistakes. Yeah. And this is not condoning that, and it's not saying, hey, go out and make them, because righteous people sometimes do that, and it's just what righteous people do. But I think it can say, even when we're really sincere, trying to do the right thing, sometimes we're going to make pretty drastic mistakes. But that doesn't have to define us. Unfortunately, it kind of defines Lot because that's all we know about him. But ultimately, I don't think it does. But just let's end with this thought. So we read the story of Lot, and we're kind of marveling, like, all right, if he was really a righteous man, how in the world did he live there as long as he did? Why did he not leave sooner? And I don't know the answer to that, but I would also imagine that Lot could look at my life, or your life, or anybody's life today and think, all right, you're a Christian, you're a righteous person. How in the world are you allowing that to go on in your life? Because he might clearly see something in our life that's kind of separating us from God. Maybe it's some of the choices that we're making with our jobs or careers or friends. So we'll maybe just kind of end with that righteous people sometimes can make really bad decisions, but that doesn't have to be defining, right?
Yep. Yes, sir.
All right, so thank you for your attention. On Sunday morning, Lord willing, Jim will be back with us, and we'll be tackling Sodom. We'll be talking primarily from Genesis chapter 19. So everybody just hang tight. The staggered releasing of the children is beginning now, and after we have everybody settled back in, we'll come back together for an invitation.
Here we go.